Forensic anthropology, 3 key things it can tell us. Group 9. What this PowerPoint will cover: age and fusion of the sacrum, determining sex from the skull, determining sex from the pelvis, dental anthropology. Age and fusion of the sacrum. In humans, the sacrum is a large triangular bone at the base of the spine. Over a human's lifetime, the structure of the sacrum changes due to the fusion of the bones. On the next slide you will obtain the information on what age certain parts of the sacrum fuse. At 18 to 25 years of age these bones fuse. At 2 to 6 years of age these bones fuse. After 25 years of age these bones fuse. At 12 to 14 years of age these bones fuse. At 2 to 6 years of age these bones fuse. At what age does everything fuse? At 12 to 14 years of age these bones fuse. At puberty these bones fuse. At 2 to 6 years of age these bones fuse. At 12 years of age these bones fuse. How old is this human? As you can see from this picture, only the lower bones have fused together. From the information given before, we can estimate that this human was around 12 years old. Dental anthropology. Age determination by teeth. The 2 dentition phases of a person's life are: early dentition, mixed dentition, permanent dentition. Development of primary teeth occurs in utero. Development can be easily seen through radiography. Why use dental identification? Tooth enamel is the hardest biological substance in the human body. Even in burned or decomposed human remains, the dentition can be used as a means of identification. When examining denture, universal tooth numbering system should be used. The age identification process. The age can be discovered by analyzing the development of the crown, root and apex and the various stages of eruption and wear. For example, it can be clearly seen that the second premolar is about to erupt, a stage that indicates an age of around 10 years old. The third molars did not erupt yet, so the age can be estimated at 10 or 11 years old. As an adolescent approaches adulthood, their dental development also approaches its end. By age 14, the only remaining tooth that has not yet completed root formation is the third molar. Therefore, the skeletal development of other bones such as clavicle and pelvis are analyzed in order to determine age. Introduction. It is possible to determine the sex of an individual by examining different features of the skull. These features commonly differ between males and females. The features which will be looked at in more detail are: Nuchal Crest, Mastoid Process, Supraorbital Margin, Mental Eminence. Nuchal Crest. The nuchal crest is located at base of the skull at the back. In females the nuchal crest is commonly smoother. Number 1, figure 1.1. In males this feature is often more pointed and pronounced. A number 5 shown below. This rule is not set, so males and females can possibly be anywhere in this scale. Mastoid process. The mastoid process is a feature of the skull located on either side, behind the mandible. In females this feature is usually a lot smaller in length. Figure 2.1. Number 1 on the scale. If a skull had a mastoid process which resembled number 5 on the scale below, it would be considered the skull of a male. As with all features, males and females can vary greatly up and down the scale below. Mastoid process. The mastoid process is a feature of the skull located on either side, behind the mandible. In females this feature is usually a lot smaller in length. Figure 2.1. Number 1 on the scale. If a skull had a mastoid process which resembled number 5 on the scale below, it would be considered the skull of a male. As with all features, males and females can vary greatly up and down the scale below. Mental eminence. The mental eminence refers to the shape of the front of the mandible. For a female this is usually more curved and less defined, a number 1 on the scale below. In a male it can take on more of a square appearance and be more prominent, a number 5 on the scale below. Once again the scale in figure 4.1 is not a conclusive determination on its own. Trauma. Neolopsan. Definition. Trauma is created when external objects or forces come into contact with the skeleton. What we can learn from trauma? We can learn when the person died, how they died, if any weapon was involved, what type of weapon was used. How does trauma help us identify when the person died? There are 3 types of trauma that can be inflicted on a person. The type inflicted depends on when the trauma was created. Ante-mortem trauma. This is when the trauma inflicted on the skeleton was created when the person was still alive. This type of trauma usually heals. Peri-mortem trauma. This when the trauma inflicted was created during or at time of the person's death. Post-mortem. This is when the trauma inflicted was created after the person has died. How does trauma help us identify how the person died? Blunt force trauma has bruising, abrasions and lacerations and is caused by a blow to the body issued by a blunt weapon. Gunshot wound can be grouped into 4 types of wound: contact, close range, intermediate range and distant range. Most gunshot wounds have a small entry wound and a much larger and more ragged exit wound. Stab wounds are commonly associated with knives or blades. A neat wound is normally caused by a knife, whereas a rugged wound would suggest a blunt instrument was used. What does this skull tell us? From looking closely, the hole in the skull is most probably where a bullet entered the skull. What does this skull tell us? From looking closely, the hole in the skull is most probably where a bullet entered the skull. Determining sex from the pelvis. The pelvis is the most reliable bony element. An anthropologist can determine the sex using the pelvis, with approximately 90% accuracy. Female. The female pelvis has a broad rounded pelvic inlet and a broader sacrum. The female pelvis tends to be broader and shorter, also has larger anterior diameter to allow to women to bear children. The female's bone is thinner and less heavy. The female's pubic arch is more wider and more angled. Male. The male pelvis has a smaller inlet and generally is narrower than the female. The inlet is more of a heart shape and the bones tend to be thicker, and heavy size varies from population to population. The pubic arch is narrower and less angled.